Thank you for being with us this morning. First and foremost, I just want to acknowledge it has been a tough week. And I appreciate everyone for joining us this morning, especially in the midst of this tough week, and hopefully the weeks to come will be much, much better. Before we get started, I would like to thank our anchor investors who have been supporting Max for the first 6 years now, I believe. So thank you to our anchor investors. If you are interested in becoming an anchor investor, please reach out to Rob LeBeau, and we'll have his information in the follow-up materials for this meeting as well. But we encourage more anchor investors. So thank you so much to our anchor investors. We've got a exciting agenda today. So Daniela Perry with Georgia Chamber, she has been our leader of Max Minutes and has just done a fabulous job with programming. And today is no exception. We've got record registration for today. And I'm sure it's because we've got just a fabulous guest, Jamie Jordan. So excited for that. And with that, I will turn it over to Daniela to take it away.
Thanks so much, Amy. And we are really excited to have Jamie here to talk about in-demand jobs, trends we've been seeing over the last year, and then what's projected. So if you haven't seen one of Jamie's presentations, you are in for a treat. We're going to learn a lot. And of course, have some opportunity for question and answer at the end. So Jamie, we'll go ahead and kick it over to you to begin the presentation.
Excellent. Can you all see my screen? Awesome. Well, good morning. It is great to be with you all on this Friday morning of what has been a very eventful week. But I'm excited about a good conversation today for us to begin to look at the world as it exists right now. As we know, a lot has changed in the last 12 months of our lives. And that is absolutely true as we begin to look at the workforce market and the labor market and what it means for jobs in general. And what it means looking forward. And is this something, and we all talk about the new normal, but what is that new normal? When will we get there? And how long will it take us to get there? So I want to spend some time today. I want to start on the first part of this presentation. Like I said, I do encourage you all to jump in at any point. If questions come up, Daniela can let me know. But I want to first start off talking about how bad was this, this crisis from a workforce and a labor standpoint. What did this do to our labor market? How jarring was this? What are the remaining impacts and where do we stand in that standpoint now? And then at the end, I want to look at a little bit of the projections based on what we know now and the data we do have that we can talk about how reliable we hope that data is and what that picture may be in terms of accuracy. But where we stand and how we can try to get our head around what we're dealing with and how as workforce development professionals or economic development professionals, how do we try to do our best job that we can going forward to make sure that we're prepared and that we serve the individuals that we work with the best. So as we first start off, I can get this to advance. There we go. One thing is for sure, this crisis brought truly historic unemployment. When we look at the fact that more than 26.5 million people filed for initial UI claims over just the first 5 weeks of this crisis, that is truly unprecedented. And it is one, as we know, if you work at all or interact with our labor system, there's a reason it was such a shock to the system and why it was so hard to catch up with a crisis that not only caught us off guard, but that from a capacity standpoint, the system is just not designed to accommodate the type of jarring effect that we first dealt with this crisis. Understanding that 26.5 million people, that is greater than the number of net jobs that was created in the entire 9.5 years since the end of the Great Recession. We had 22.4 million jobs that was created since that recession ended. And in a matter of 5 weeks, you had 26.5 million people that applied for unemployment. So that type of economic change that rapidly, there's no way to say it's not jarring, and there's no way for that not to have repercussions beyond once the COVID-19 pandemic began to lighten up. To give you an understanding of just how jarring that was, on the week of March 28th, almost 7 million people applied for unemployment in just that 1 week. And that record is nearly 10 times higher than what the previous weekly record was from 1982, which was only 695,000 people. So put that into context, and to try to do so, I have this chart to give you an idea of just how jarring those first few weeks of this crisis were to our labor system. So this shows you weekly claims since 1967, and you can see through the Great Recession and other economic booms and busts that have happened throughout that time. And that line you see on the far right, those were the UI claims for those first few weeks. And so you see that the reason our labor system was overwhelmed and why we still are even trying to recover from that, because it was just so unprecedented and our system is just not designed to serve a crisis of that nature. This shows you our unemployment rate overall in Georgia, this is a national unemployment rate from the beginning of this year to the end. Obviously, as you can see, things have improved slightly for sure. When we were looking at the height of this, an unemployment rate of just shy of 15%. That has obviously come down, and we're thankful for that. But we are still hovering, and as of this morning, it's still at 6.7%. And so that is itself almost double. This is actually more than double what the unemployment rate was prior to this crisis. If you look at that back in the beginning of March of this year, we were looking at about a 3.5% unemployment rate, actually a little bit lower than that. And so the fact that we're now at just shy of 7% seems insignificant, but when you're talking about double unemployment, that is still very high. And when in these numbers, it seems like it's not that much when we were looking at numbers of 14 and 15, but understanding that at the height of the Great Depression, unemployment only got to 18%. And so when you put that in context, you realize that just because the 6.7 seems tremendously lower than the 14%, it is still a very, not where we would want to be, less than ideal unemployment rate as we stand now. And as you can tell, even though it was declining, we'll talk a little bit in a minute, it seems to be plateauing right there for a little bit. And we don't know how long that's going to last and what the implications will be. So as we begin to look a little more at the data, as of the end of last month, so we got some of that data this morning, 10.9 million Americans still remain unemployed. There's currently 19.2 million Americans who are still receiving UI benefits. Now, the gap in those two numbers, that may seem disparate, but the reason for that is because that's how many people are currently considered disconnected from the workforce and not currently seeking employment. And that's the unique nature of this crisis and the way a lot of people just, because of the nature of the pandemic, they do not have the opportunity to seek new employment. So when you look at the unemployment numbers, that considers individuals who are unemployed and actively seeking employment. But that 19.2 million number shows you the ones who are relying on UI benefits to get by. Again, to put that in context, at the same exact time last year, so December of 2019, there were only 1.8 million people who were on those benefits at that same time. So 1.8 versus 19.2, that shows you the difference in the scenario from 1 year ago at this time. As we know, even though we have recovered and the economy has rebounded in some way, we've only regained about half of the 22 million jobs that were initially lost during this pandemic. Now, again, those are just the initial 22 million we lost. We have continued to lose jobs throughout this, and our office manages and oversees the WARN notices that come through in partnership with GDOL. And we continue to get WARN notices every week. You know, I've got probably a dozen this week, anywhere from 30 to 300 people who are projected to be laid off in the coming months. So the repercussions of this are still ongoing. We are by no means out of the fog. Are certain areas getting better, and have they improved? Absolutely. But this is where it is such a unique economic crisis, where it is not one where every industry has, faced a downturn in the same way. As some industries have been able to rebound, others remain completely, depressed in this area. And it's tough, and it has made this a unique crisis to try to address, and it has brought its own unique challenges. The number of permanent job losers, meaning those who have been laid off, it's not expected to be temporary, and there's no promise at all that job will ever come back, currently is at about 3.7 million, and it's remained steady there for the last 3 or 4 months. And that's about 3 times the pre-pandemic level of what we were looking at on a rolling average. So again, pretty severe, and that's one that we've got to be realistic and sober about the fact of where we still stand. When we look at the number of people who are out of work but are unable to look for work, that has increased steadily over the last 3 or 4 months. And we continue, and that's projected for at least the first few months of Q1 because of the nature of the pandemic, as cases continue to rise again, and until we get a better idea of what vaccine distribution will look like, we anticipate that uncertainty continue. And I think one thing we have to always keep in mind is everything we're discussing here, there still continues to be stark disparities along racial lines. African Americans and Hispanics continue to, all these numbers we talk about in the unemployment rate continue to be much more severe in those populations, and that's something as workforce developers we have to be aware of as we try to address this moving forward. So as we talk about a recovery, there's a couple of questions we have to ask and things for us to consider. One is, how long until we're at a total recovery? Recent labor reports show that, again, that recovery is already starting to decelerate. It had picked up earlier in the middle, after early, late summer, and we're seeing that has kind of slowed down, and that's what I said earlier, it's starting to seem like it's plateauing. And I think experts intend that will probably continue for at least a few more months. As we continue to have ongoing uncertainty around the virus and the vaccine, it has sustained industrial fear and hesitancy. So companies are still hesitant to make that next leap or step forward because they don't know if they're going to have to pull back again if there is another wave. And I think we're in the middle of that right now, and we're seeing that hesitancy. At the same time, we also know when we just got numbers, actually this morning, that the non-farm payroll employment from December actually decreased by 140,000. So for this week, we kind of actually took a step back from this month's report because we actually lost people on payroll instead of adding it to that. We have to ask how many companies still will potentially shutter completely. You have a lot of companies early on that thought, we can make these cuts and we can try to weather this storm. But as the severity of how long they're having to stay shut down or at reduced staffing levels continues, it is having a toll on a lot of companies that at the beginning may have thought they could, wait this out and try to get through it, that it's now lasting much longer than a lot of them anticipated. And so that's where a lot of those warn notices that are coming in now are inspired. It's because they may have thought they could based on those cuts and furloughs, and it just has not been enough to sustain them. And even for the ones that do survive and the ones that bounce back, questions that we don't know are what percentage of previous staffing levels will they return to? Will a company eventually, once things are back to normal, will they go back to the amount of employees they had before, or are they going to downsize now? And how quickly will it take them to get back to that point, even if they do? We have a couple of experts and firms that have studied this to try to begin to predict better, and one of those is Moody's Analytics that you're probably familiar with. And Moody's probably has the most grim outlook on this. They suggest it could take until early 2024 until the 22 million jobs that we lost are restored to our economy here in the U.S. So that is a much longer timeline than I think most of us would have ever anticipated, and hopefully it is a lot sooner than that. But based on their analysis and what they've looked at of the factors of not anticipating all companies bringing back the full jobs they had, they believe that's the timeline we should be realistic for of getting all of those 22 million jobs back. S&P Global, they said they believe unemployment levels won't return to pre-COVID levels until after 2023. So when we're talking about that 3.5% that we had gotten used to for a little bit pre-pandemic, they don't believe that we'll see that again in that level at least until after 2023. So some of the industrial disruptions. So what are some things we can expect as we talk about how is this going to change in general, change the economy that we work in and the workforce that we are, the labor market that we work with? Some of the things that affected industries overall. So in the beginning of this, your prices of a lot of your risk assets fell sharply, and that had tremendous impacts on a lot of industries such as manufacturing and construction, and especially suppliers to those industries, because a lot of obviously as those prices are cut, their profits are cut, and so at a time when they were already cutting back what they were able to do, they were making much less money on it because of the fact that those assets had cut back so much and then produced so much. And that's why we saw the largest drop in our manufacturing output since 1946. Now, again, that has begun to tick back up, and you'll see this at the bottom of the slide. That actually now, thankfully, as things have returned a little bit, productivity is actually up 4% this year, which does sound like good news, and it is. I mean, considering everything that has taken place this year, the fact that our manufacturing productivity is up 4% is good news, but it's alarming for us as workforce professionals because what that shows to those manufacturing employees is that they're able to maintain or increase productivity at the reduced staffing levels that COVID has created. Is that likely to mean that some of these jobs may never return because they realize from an efficiency standpoint, they don't need those jobs to remain productive. And that is something we have to keep in mind and keep in view as we move forward. But a couple of other trends that, I believe we should anticipate and that we know are already occurring that will have workforce implications. And these have been expedited, I believe, due to COVID. So one that we've talked about a lot is kind of this transition from brick and mortar retail to more e-commerce focused retail. All of us know, I'm sure every one of us since March of 2020 have probably purchased a lot more online goods than we probably did prior. And that is true of everyone by nature. When you're in your home and you're trying to limit your exposure to the outside world, you're going to turn to e-commerce. But it is very likely that now consumers have developed new behaviors that will last well beyond this pandemic. You've gotten used to it. You have segments of our population that may not have been comfortable with online retail that had to get so now. Older consumers that may not have wanted to venture into that, but now are forced to protect their own health, now realize that it's not as hard or as concerning as they thought. And so we do believe that will just expedite the trend that had already begun. It's not something that wasn't occurring, but we do believe, some believe this could move that up anywhere from 5 to 10 years sooner than what was already occurring. And we know the implications that will have, as we know still in the state of Georgia and many states, the largest occupational sector or industrial sector by numbers is retail. And so as those jobs shift from those traditional brick and mortar retail jobs, where do they go? How do we try to help those people, retrain to make sure they're prepared for the new jobs? We talk about manufacturing, and with that productivity is this even faster shift toward automation. when you're a manufacturer and you are faced with something like a global health pandemic, you've got to figure out, how do we remain productive? How can we stay moving even in the face of something like this? If, say, God forbid, something crops up like this in another year or two, well, for a manufacturer, that's going to be automation, because if you can have your, a manufacturing plant that can continue to operate without the fear of spread among employees, the easiest way to do that is by minimizing the number of employees, and for the ones you have, being able to keep them completely socially distanced. That is automation. So we do anticipate, we're already seeing that will have impacts on manufacturing, and just making that transition to automation and more advanced manufacturing more rapid. And so we've got to be more realistic in that regard too, of understanding how that will likely reduce the overall numbers that has been consistently occurring since the 60s. But we should probably see that what has been a steady decline likely being a little more stark of the number of actual manufacturing employees numbers, the actual payroll number going down, but our productivity continue to go up. And then also, as we know, the required training level there will go up, because as you automate, more skills are required to do that effectively. From a healthcare standpoint, this has been a very unique challenge. And so if you know or have worked with anyone that works in healthcare, this has probably been one of the most challenging crises that they've had to face, not just because it's been a strain on the acute care side of hospitals. We're all very familiar with that. But you may also be familiar that while they have had a high increase in demand on the acute care for a long time and continued, on the elective surgery and elective care side, it's been tremendously down. A lot of those elective surgeries were cut off in the beginning of COVID, and even once they were restored, a lot of people have now foregone a lot of those elective surgeries until after the COVID pandemic has passed, because they don't want to take a chance of exposing themselves by going into the hospital for a surgery that may not be paramount right now, and take a chance of contracting the virus. And so they're saying, hey, I'll just wait till this calms down. Things are uncertain for my family financially anyway, so I'm going to wait until I know things are better before I go forward with that surgery. It's not critical right now. Problem is, that is where hospitals make the lion's share of their profit. And so a lot of hospitals are really struggling right now with the fact that their acute care side is really stressed, and the part where they make the money to fund the other side is down right now. So you have them furloughing workers on the elective care side, but desperately trying to find as much help as they can on the acute care side, and doing so with fewer resources to pay for those people. And so it is a very unique challenge for healthcare. And I think at the same time, with a crisis like this, where you're trying to limit your healthcare personnel exposure to the virus, things like a rise in telehealth, we knew they're already shifting there, especially in places like rural Georgia. But even beyond rural Georgia, where there was part of a necessity because there just wasn't healthcare infrastructure there to get access to, now you have, even in the city, I know for myself, now you have it where instead of them wanting you to come in to see if you're exposed to COVID, I had a consultation with my doctor over my iPhone. And so I think you're going to see that become more commonplace as well, because I think this pandemic has led to a reevaluation of our basic health practices, even in primary care medicine, because we realize now that maybe what we were doing before, to where you had the same people coming into a doctor's office to have their annual exam as they already get diagnosed with the flu, is maybe not the wisest when neither one of them are wearing masks, and that's why our flu numbers were likely have been higher in the past. So I think you will see a shift to that even more now, where if you are someone that is exhibiting symptoms that is more commonly associated with something that could be a spreadable illness of some sort, whether it's the common cold or flu, it's likely they're going to want to treat you now via telehealth, so that you do not come into the doctor's office or a facility where you can put their workers at risk or put other patients at risk. And so we need to be realistic too of what will that workforce implication be, because now you're going to have people who can man that telehealth side more robustly, and that's going to be individuals. It's not just going to be doctors. I'm sure you'll now be training assistants and administrative assistants that will be managing that for the doctors themselves before it gets to the doctor. And so we know that will likely change what the workforce demand is from our primary care standpoint, to training more individuals who are able to accommodate those types of services. And then one that's a little more non-traditional that you may not have heard much about, but we know will have ripple effects on multiple industries, is part of the pandemic. There's been a discussion for a long time in the entertainment industry around this shift to direct to streaming. That sounds cool to us. For us, from a consumer, it just sounds like a better added convenience. But when you're someone that works either in the movie theater industry or an industry that supports that industry, it is very alarming, because they have been talking about for years, and it was thought by 2025, we may have studios that were, instead of releasing by contract directly to a theater like we're traditionally seeing, that they may have feature-length films that are directly to the streaming service of that studio. Well, the pandemic moved that up 5 years, and Disney was the first to make that jump, and they released their first feature-length film direct to to their streaming device, and now we know there's been 7 others since. And so we saw during this pandemic a renegotiation of the agreement between studios and the theater. It used to be it had to be in the theater for at least 4 months. That was renegotiated down now to 17 days. That is a dramatic change over one time, but it was, all because of the pandemic. And, the theaters just weren't in a bargaining power to push back on the studios. The studios needed to generate revenue. The theaters had no way to say, we can help you do that during this pandemic. And so it pushed them where they lost, almost 70% of what that time was for them to generate revenue. And so we know there's a lot of fear there that some of these theater companies may not make it through this. And there's no, outcome for them looking forward that may be promising for them to hold on to. And so that obviously has implications, not just from the direct workforce that is employed in those theaters across the country, but it has, when you look at commercial real estate and then looking at those support industries that all support those theaters, what does that mean from a workforce standpoint of employment? And then what are the other industrial, ripples that may come from that on the studio side? So new environment in terms of occupational demand. What are they going to be? What are the demands going to be moving forward? What training will be required as a result? Job markets, luckily, right now, they are expected to tick up in Q1 of this year. While unemployment remains high, as I mentioned earlier, job postings are increasing. So it is encouraging to see that companies are finally starting to bring some of those people back or looking at creating new positions in their new environment. The Manpower Group projects at a net employment outlook of about 17% for this first quarter. And that's a 3% increase from last quarter in the end of 2020. But again, to put that in perspective, even though that seems robust and you would expect it to be since we're recovering from a stark downturn, it's still a 2% decrease from where we were at Q1 2020. So we are still not even growing. You would think when we're at the end of what was considered an economic boom, you would think now a quick recovery would be a much larger number of economic growth, but it's not. That 17% is still down 2% from where we were at the beginning of last year. Only 13% of employers right now expect that their pre-pandemic hiring will return before July of this year. There was 54% of that. When we asked that same question was asked in Q2 of 2020, 54% thought that their pre-pandemic hiring would be back before July of this year. That's now down to 13%. And I think that's a product of the ongoing uncertainty related to the pandemic. And as the numbers continue to go up, employers just realize, okay, the likelihood of us getting back to normal before then is just not going to happen. But the good news is July does still remain that mark where most people believe they expect that we'll have distribution of the vaccine out there widely enough that they believe July will be as close to a new normal for us to begin a true recovery. We hope it stays there, and obviously we know anything could happen to affect that. There's a lot of uncertainty, but we want to stay hopeful that we can look and let July be our target for when we can begin to see maybe we can start a return to normalcy in some regard. But again, even with that in mind, I always hedge it with this caveat that we need to keep in mind that even though market conditions may return to normal for companies to begin to try to address the crisis and how it hit their company, we need to be prepared that it is very likely that companies will use this crisis to shed existing or pre-existing liabilities and burdens that were there prior to the pandemic. And this has allowed them to see, hey, we couldn't have made this strategic cut before from a morale standpoint, but now this is a perfect chance for us to take that business unit that's part of our corporation that has not been profitable for the last 18 months, and now we can just completely eliminate that with the hedge of the pandemic, and we can save morale and save face with our employees that are there still because the pandemic will offer a shield for that. Companies prior, when things were great, you don't want to be the one that looks to create uncertainty for your shareholders if you're cutting an entire business unit in the middle of an economic boom. But there's no better time than to do that when you're in the middle of an economic crisis from a pandemic. And so I think we need to be prepared that it's very likely that we won't completely return to pre-pandemic levels for every industry and company because they'll likely use this, this crisis to try to increase efficiency in their rebound. Are there any questions before we jump? I don't see the box, but if there is one, Danielle or Amy, if you see one, let me know.
Jamie, we've got one question from Patrick Ledford. With all the innovation in various sectors taking place in response to the pandemic, and identify the importance of business and industry aligning their workforce needs with their CTAE and post-secondary partners. I feel like we were in a position of importance pre-pandemic with the need for talent. How do you see that shifting in a little bit, and how do you see that partnership going?
Absolutely. In the next few slides, I'll get into what we think some of those projections will be. But I will say, I'll add the caveat, we still don't know. And this is one where, I'll share this data, but I'm going to share it with the fact that because things are still so uncertain, data can only be reliable and be stable if the conditions that you're placing in to generate that data are. And obviously they're not right now. And so we can't 100% say that the numbers we're going to be looking at in these coming slides are 100% accurate, or even as accurate as they would have been had I given this presentation at this same time last year. And so we don't know. Yes, it will still be key. And I think once things do stable out a little more and we begin to get a better idea and a better picture of what those industrial demands will be, I think that absolutely it will be critical that we continue building those partnerships, as Amy said, that we were making progress on, because that's the only way the system can work. And if we don't have that connection at the K through 12 level, we're never going to build the long-term pipeline that we know we need. The challenge at this moment remains is that there's still so many question marks of what the future holds. And like I said, just the questions I have here on the slide of, how will this change for industries altogether? And will this be a chance when you see entire industries pivot completely now because they've learned some key things during this pandemic and the way they structure their business unit and the way they structure their workforce? We just don't know. And so I think we'll see more, and I think companies don't know yet either, and I think they're just trying to weather the uncertainty now before they make too many key strategic decisions. But I think we'll likely see some of those decisions made in Q1 and Q2 of this year, and I think after that we'll have a better idea to begin predicting of what this new standard is. I see another question that just came in from Tim. Hello, Tim. Good to hear from you. How do you see internship and apprenticeship opportunities for students and adults shifting during and post-pandemic? Well, it has certainly shifted, and that has been the challenge. In our office, we have what are called sector partnerships. And a big strategy of that, a big focus is us encouraging more internship and apprenticeship. Well, when people are forced out of the workforce because the employer can't let their existing employees come in because of exposure, the last thing they're doing is bringing in interns or new apprentices. And so it absolutely has had a dramatic effect on that, and we have seen that turn. The good news is we have seen companies interested in apprenticeship. There's an uptick there to try to retrain existing staff. And it is already giving us a glimpse of what companies are doing because they realize they are going to change and try to innovate some as a response to this pandemic. And so that has been encouraging that we've seen some interest there, but not really in terms of expansion and bringing in new people. And so in that regard, it has made it a challenge. But I'm hopeful, again, maybe once we get to that July mark and some of the fears are gone, once the vaccine is more widely distributed, that we will see a return to normalcy so that we can begin to try to put more people into internships and apprenticeships, because that will remain a key tool and mechanism as we try to train for what are going to be new demands. So great questions. Move to the next slide. So these are jobs. So when we're looking at what happened throughout the pandemic, so if we look at the last 6 months of 2020 and we say, okay, what were the job postings at that time statewide here in Georgia? So what you're seeing here, these were the top jobs that were being hired throughout the pandemic. And so this is where really your highest occupational demands remain now. And I think if we look through this and we talk about it strategically, it's not really super surprising here, because as we just mentioned with e-commerce and an uptick on the actual consumer supplies or consumer goods overall actually went up during this because people were at home consuming more, buying more. You're bored, so you think you need to get something more. I'm as guilty of that as anyone. And most of us probably had 10 Amazon packages on our porch every other day. And that's why you see that first line as what it is, because then it put a really strain on our logistics industry, because overnight, the strain and the amount on demand of how many people were purchasing things that needed to be shipped and shipped rapidly went through the roof. And so we've continued to see logistics companies boom. It's been good for them in a lot of sense, in some sense. I don't want to say overall. There's still challenges, obviously, when you get to the warehousing side and how you manage a warehouse that requires 500 people to function, and you can't have but 200 in there now because of the virus. That has created challenges on that side of the spectrum. But from a tractor trailer truck standpoint, a truck driver, that has been, as you can see, the number one. Again, probably not surprising on the registered nurse standpoint, because as I said, we've had a shortage on the acute care side. Still continues right now. I've spoken to 3 of my nurse friends in the last few weeks, and they are really, really struggling. In fact, they can't find people so much that they're having to bump up. They're currently, starting in the pandemic earlier on, offered the nurses that are working overtime an additional $50 an hour for overtime pay. Starting the week of Christmas, my friend said they offered an additional $30 on top of that per hour, plus a $50 Amazon gift card for every day that they agree to work that's not typically scheduled day for them. So there's a lot of strain there right now. And she said, they're in a situation where, they're having to take, new nurses that really technically aren't ready to probably be on their own to serve a patient by themselves, but they're having to, make them do so because they're so short-staffed, because having not fully comfortable and trained nurse is better than not having one at all. And so it is a dire situation there right now, and hospitals are doing all they can to find more. It's just you don't produce new nurses overnight. And we've known this. This was an issue and a shortage we were having prior to COVID. And we've talked about nursing for years now, and this pandemic has just made it even more severe. But again, we have to look at what does that mean once this slows down? So we have this uptick in acute care. Can we easily now shift those nurses that have been brought in on the acute care side over to the elective care side and it level out? Are you going to potentially have another rebound effect afterward when the patient number and patient demand goes down? Will there potentially be a surplus at that point? Those are questions we just don't know yet, and we have to wait and see what that happens. Another one, again, that could be surprising on the retail side. And this is because, again, as industries have tried to rebound, or the ones that have stayed, back open or never closed down, that's why you see that demand there. And then I think the last one I'll talk about there is the software developer. I don't think it's a surprise why the IT industry has had a strain or had a boom during this crisis. All of us doing what we're doing right now, there's a lot more people, meeting virtually, trying to use new innovations in software as they're trying to keep track of and tabs on their employees who are now probably working fully remotely. So the IT industry and the consulting in that regard has gone through the roof, and so that's why you see the demands as it relates to IT there. And the same with something like a customer service representative. There's more call centers now where people are trying to get access to stuff remotely, and so they need more people who can serve those people remotely. So I think all of these are kind of in line with what we would expect for what was hired during the pandemic. Now, one thing that I think is an interesting trend, and we can talk about this maybe in the questions, because I don't want to belabor too much more time, but what we're seeing with job postings right now, 72% of the roles currently posting have lower requirements, so job requirements, entry-level requirements, than they did in January of 2020. And so that is interesting to see and for us to begin to think about when that has been kind of bucks the trend that we've seen for a long time of jobs requiring more skills, and us talking about the skills gap there. I think it may be a unique facet of this pandemic, and it may be, I think it's a good thing long-term as we look for entry-level workers, because I think what people are realizing, companies that did have to scale up quickly, they said, listen, we just need whoever we can get, we'll train you. They realized instead of saying you got to have 3 years work experience, if you only have 6 months, you have none at all, come on and we'll try it. Because you had companies like IT companies or logistics companies and companies that were trying to bring on a lot of, call center reps that just needed to, to staff up quickly. And I think that is probably a product of what we see in these, pandemic jobs where they lower those requirements because they needed a larger pool to choose from. We can hope that that stays, after this, so that we can try to begin to get people pushed into jobs that we know may struggle otherwise, who don't have that work experience that a lot of these 5-year requirements push out. Hopefully that'll make it a little bit easier. Another question just saw come in.
Jamie,
any prediction?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
One question, and I was trying to type it, and I thought it'd be easier to ask. Around the tractor trailer drivers, we know that retention has been a huge issue, right? And I know demand is going up because everybody's having the 10 Amazon packages delivered daily. But how much of that do you think is really a retention issue versus, growth in that? Where's the mix there?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is absolutely a mixed bag there. I think we know, and that's been an issue that I think the industry has tried to grapple with for a while, but I still think have got to figure out ways to address it. Turnover in that industry has been an issue for a long time. I mean, since when I did HTCI 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, we were talking about that then and figuring out how they were going to solve it. They clearly have not, because I agree with you. I think that number, if it's half and half of what those demands are, I don't know. The data, unfortunately, doesn't really decipher of why the job they're hiring was open. And companies don't want you, they're not going to completely show their hand on that regard. But I think you're right. I think it is a mix of both. And we, from a workforce standpoint, absolutely have to think of that, because we don't want to help someone train and get into a job that they then don't even want to stay in because the environment's not ideal. That is a fair question. The question that came in from Tim, any predictions and trends you're seeing in commercial or residential real estate, and even how schools and universities might rethink campus or classroom design? Any sage advice for our economic development agencies that are looking at this same data and scratching our heads? Fantastic question. And I think it's one that's not helpful, I know, but this is probably the one that does still remain a tremendous question mark. When you're, especially in a city here in Atlanta, as we know, commercial real estate has been booming here. And the good news is, from the standpoint of those that work in the field, we see a lot of these projects, even spec projects that were proposed here in Atlanta prior to the pandemic, that are now starting to move forward. So I don't have the answers that they're seeing from an industry standpoint that is giving them hope that there's not going to be a total collapse of commercial retail, of commercial real estate, the way some people predicted. I don't know if they just anticipate that while right now it seems like people are comfortable working remotely, so therefore will never return to an office, maybe they just think that trend will eventually reverse. And once things are safe again and people are comfortable in person again, you know, a year from now, a year and a half from now, that they think that companies will go back to kind of a pre-pandemic situation. That's kind of the discussion I've heard. A lot of these large commercial real estate projects, they're not going to be finished in 6 months anyway. So they know their construction timeline is 24 or more months. So they're anticipating that by the time the project delivers, we will be back to a normal world where people are wanting functional office space. Yes, the nature of it may be different, but they think there'll still be enough demand there for them to move forward with, you know, $200 million commercial real estate project. So again, don't know for sure that that's changing in any way in that regard. How it changes from an economic development standpoint, I think we do have to be realistic, especially in other parts, even outside of Metro Atlanta. It makes it hard because when you start talking about whether, you know, investing in industrial parks and how you do this strategically, I think it is hard right now because it is so uncertain of what is going to be that demand from an industrial standpoint in 24 months. We just don't know. And so is there still going to be a trend like we've seen in the last few years toward, you know, these large warehousing stores to support e-commerce and also, you know, to support the transport of goods coming in from the port? I think yes. I think we know there's still going to be a movement of goods, so I don't see that as much changing. But I think in terms of when it looks at corporate real estate, there's a big question mark there that we just don't know. We saw the companies that have already cut back a lot. You know, we kind of went through that real purge there at the beginning of the pandemic. It looks like they're trying to stabilize out a little bit now, but there was a rapid expansion right before the pandemic, and it just kind of hit them hard, and you saw them begin to contract. And there were several projects here in Atlanta that they pulled out of that they'd committed to. Will that go away and get back to normal? I wish I had the answer to that, but if I did, I don't think I'd be in the job I'm in now, and I'd probably be making a whole lot more money. On the university and the college side, I think that is an interesting point. And it's one that is going, I think, will definitely, I think, require some introspection. Now, what change we see in the short term, I don't know. You know, the university can't really just, you know, write off an asset that's a building they don't need anymore and then sell it off or leave it. So, I mean, I think there will be, I think, some, you know, strategic realignment as they began to look at now and getting more comfortable with electronic delivery of education. And we're already seeing that. We see here in the technical colleges how we've had to shift to offering things remotely that never were prior to the pandemic. And I don't see that ever going away. I think that allows you to expand your potential student base. It allows you to provide offerings that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think that will long-term definitely have an impact on what our need for brick and mortar, you know, classrooms are. Does that mean they'll ever go away completely? No, because I think any of us that have kind of done a program that has both, you do know there are benefits from an education standpoint of having that in-person instruction and delivery. So I don't think you'll see that completely go away, but absolutely it may see some of these large campus footprints of our large universities. That could change, and you may not see the growth that may have been projected or, you know, forecast prior to the pandemic. See a question here from Patrick. What are your thoughts on the restaurant/culinary industry's ability to bounce back from the impact of COVID-19? Some companies such as Chipotle are establishing locations that are not the traditional brick and mortar site, using them as only delivery locations for Uber Eats, DoorDash, etc. I definitely think this is an industry that more than any other, they already had to really innovate to try to stay afloat during the pandemic. I think you've seen changes in policy in terms of, you know, delivery. You've seen cities change their ordinances, like here in Atlanta, where you can now get alcoholic beverages to go. I think some of that, I think, will absolutely stay because we enjoyed those aspects. It may have taken years to get there prior to the pandemic, but the crisis kind of precipitated us needing to do that. And so I think when you look at some of it has not all been bad. People talk about like al fresco dining. There's been a shift toward that anyway, and the pandemic wanting to be outdoors shifted that already. And so there's real discussions here in the city around potentially, you know, these businesses or restaurants that are on streets of actually doing away with the on-street parking and making that outside dining instead. Those were discussions that urbanists had wanted for years, but there was never really traction prior to COVID. And now there are real considerations for long-term implications of that being the new norm. And so I do think, you know, there will be a shift, a continued shift. Hopefully things will get easier once again, people aren't as apprehensive about being indoors in closed environments due to the virus. And I think you're already seeing here in Metro Atlanta, for better or worse, a desire and a return to want to get back to that level of normalcy. We're blessed here in the city to have a fantastic restaurant scene, and it has been really tough to see some of the best in the city struggle or, you know, fold due to this. And I think that will continue because it's already, the restaurant industry is a very slim margin industry. And so it's tough in good times. It is impossible in bad times. And so even the best and most skilled can tell you that even if they're functioning now, it's functioning in a way just to survive. They are not thriving right now. It's not where they're just reeking in profits. A lot of it is still trying to make up what was lost during the early times, early stage of the pandemic. And so there's still a lot of uncertainty. And when you talk about July, that's another 6 months of this. And I'm sure those numbers could be really daunting to a restaurateur. So that's another, there's still a lot of question mark. We just don't know. Brandon Olna, we've been seeing a paradox of companies needing to upskill existing employees for the reasons you outlined, but they're also unable to make that investment given the economic impacts they've experienced. Are there services and resources from TCSG as a whole or other state partners that are in the pipeline to help upskill these employees at significantly reduced costs to the company? Well, obviously Brandon is familiar with, and if the rest of you aren't, you have our system overall, WorkSource Georgia, which does provide training to unemployed and underemployed, but also to help with incumbent worker training. Challenges that we're facing right now, though, is we have very limited resources at the moment. We will see as, Congress, hopefully, if there's functionality that returns and begins to look at what assistance is needed, that we are hoping will be a focus of additional supplemental resources to pump into the workforce and labor system, because we definitely need more money right now. There's so many people that are unemployed just trying to put out that fire. It makes it impossible to then prioritize something like incumbent worker training, because you put out the first fire of those who have no income instead of focusing on the ones that you're trying to upskill their income or upskill their abilities to then increase their income. So yes, resources exist. They're just not abundant right now, at least not to the level to address a crisis of this nature. Unfortunately, systems like ours, our funding mechanisms and formulas are based on previous economic activity from the previous 2 or 3 years. Well, our current funding year was based on 3 of the strongest economic years we've had in the last century. And so now that you're suddenly thrust into this very unique economic situation, you don't just get new funding overnight to try to address that problem. And so we are in a tough situation right now. Well, while we have some emergency funding that we're working with COVID to try to help with temporary employment and again with some training, it's not really air for incumbent worker training. But again, we're hopeful that there will be discussions on that at the congressional level, and that will hopefully lead to supplemental income. Sandy Lake, what are you hearing in terms of employers requiring or having the ability to require the vaccine of all employees? Are employers allowed to make that a requirement for employment? I can't say I've heard a lot about this. I know there's been discussions and we've talked about this possibility. Depending on the industry, I absolutely could see that being a possibility. And to my knowledge, I am by no means an employment attorney. I could see, there's other, just the way you may have a drug testing requirement and that be legal, I could 100% see that being a possibility that as a private company, if you don't want to take on the potential liability that could come with an employee that refuses to vaccinate, that being a requirement for employment. It's not, if that's a standard across the board rule, it can't be said that that's used to, identify or, isolate one person and being done in a discriminatory way. Now, I am not an attorney on this, so I'm sure this will absolutely be a question that will rage in the coming months and year, as people may have different reasons for justifying why they choose not to take the vaccine. And so if that then becomes where it seems like that's identifying a protected class of people that are choosing that, then yes, that may potentially become problematic. But I feel certain we will, at least early on, as it becomes more widely distributed, see companies who intend or try to do that. Will there be a pushback or any legal ramifications? We don't know yet. But I think that's a fair question and something we should probably expect. All right, I'll keep going. Feel free to, again, pop in at any point and ask any other questions. So as we look at industrial rebound, the forecast of which industries are expected to rebound the quickest, or at least have the largest percentage increase in 2021, we've talked about it. Manufacturing is always at the top of the list, both nationally and here in Georgia. Supply chains are now starting to rebound. People don't understand, even like here in Georgia with the Kia plant, when you have the level of efficiency that is found in advanced manufacturing now, the smallest disruption in the supply chain there can really shut everything down. That Kia plant is what is called a just-in-time, just-in-sequence plant, meaning they get the inventory they need to make a car about an hour before it's needed. So you have about an hour's worth of inventory, and every piece of that supply chain comes in at that point in that hour. And so when anything shut down in that regard, it completely sets everything back. So while the 6 suppliers down the road may open back up, if it's another supplier further out that's in another state that hasn't opened back up, that one supplier can shut you down unless you're able to find an alternate supplier in the meantime. And so I think it's taken that almost an entire year for that supply chain to really try to stabilize, or at least to level off back to a point where they can try to function again. And that's why we're seeing that uptick in productivity again. Hospitality, surprisingly, is one that is expected to rebound pretty dramatically, but again, only in specific areas. As people who are getting cabin fever are trying to travel and return to that in some regard, those areas that are really heavy on, traditional, hospitality as it goes to personal travel are expected to see an uptick there. And that's why states like Florida are expected to see the biggest uptick in their hospitality. The challenge is if it's the level of hospitality that is usually business travel, that is the one that is going to continue to struggle. There's not much prediction for seeing that return to normal anytime before this summer and really in this calendar year, but they are hopeful that as it returns to personal travel and leisure, that we'll see an uptick there. But again, that percentage growth is only going to seem the most dramatic for them because they're the one that was hit the most severely, and they really have seen pretty much no growth in return to that thus far. And so any chance for them to grow is going to be very dramatic because it has been probably uniquely the one industry that has seen the biggest stark and drop overall. And because a lot of that, people don't realize the hospitality industry in general relies on business travel probably 70% for their income. And so when that stopped completely, and you're looking at things like conventions and trade shows and that all stopping completely, it really was devastating to that industry and the entertainment industry in general. And so that is one where we're hopeful it can begin to rebound. That is an industry where we don't know what the future holds and what the long-term implications will be after we do rebound because there has just been so stark. Transportation, we've talked about. Utilities, I have no insight in there why that's growing, but it is one of the ones that's been predicted to increase. And then again, wholesale and retail trade as that continues to get back, as in-person retail, brick and mortar retail tries to rebound, and the same with online. And then lastly, and then again, we can have a chat and any questions. That's a lot. I have 2 more slides. So when we look at 2021, these are your top 10 occupations that are expected to be the most in demand for 2021. To be honest, it's right in line with what we already talked about earlier with the jobs that were posted during the crisis. So nothing surprising here as we talk about the industrial trends that we're seeing. And then the same long term, when you look at what data is showing right now for long-term growth through 2029, when we look at our top 10 high growth, high earning jobs, these are those top 10. And again, I don't think there are any surprises here with everything that's already been discussed. As you see a lot, you're going to see a shift toward analytical business operations type positions because as companies continue to need to evolve and innovate, they're going to want individuals that can come in and analyze these new reams of data that they have developed as a result of the pandemic and figure out what the heck do we do with this, what's our path forward. And so I think long term, you're still going to see a shift, as we have already seen, toward high skill business support operations. And I think that's what you see here in several of these positions. All right, any other questions, discussions, thoughts? Hopefully that was intriguing. What are your best data sources for information and trends? So we use a few different ones. So for the job postings, we use Burning Glass Technologies. We also use BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics release it. We'll use a lot of that raw data, but we also have contracts with EMSI, or MZ, which is a software company that also takes that raw data from BLS and a couple other sources and tries to create a little more robust predictive models. And so we use those the most. And Kramer. How can we continue to focus on narrowing the wealth gap, economic equity, and digital divide in the midst of survival? And it is a fantastic question, and it is one that definitely alarms and concerns me because I know a pandemic like this, we've been working, as you know, you've been in the trenches on this for a while now. This is an issue that as workforce developers we have worried about for a long time. And I do fear that a pandemic like this can only make that worse. And I think we're naive if we say that this hasn't set us back in some regard in trying to address some of those inequities. I do fear, even once we return to, potentially return to pre-pandemic employment levels, that it will have implications on wage levels. I can see employers using the reduction in revenue as a result of the pandemic as justification to say, hey, we'll bring you back, but we can only afford to bring you back at 70 or 80% of the wage we were at you at before. I mean, it's your choice. Better than no job, but this is the best we can do. And so we know those individuals that are likely to be affected by that are the ones that are already at the bottom end of this wealth gap. And so it worries me that we're going to get to a place where we actually see, we were on an uptick for the last few years of seeing the wage finally tick up. And I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid when we look back at this time 5 years from now, we're going to see that there was a dip down because of the impacts of this, because companies using that as a justification of how they have to survive. And I don't say that in an accusatory manner toward those companies. I get it. It's just from a business standpoint realistic to say, as I said before, no company wants to be the one in the middle of an economic boom to tell their employees, hey, we're giving you a pay cut, because they were already trying to starve for talent anyway. But at a time now where companies have an excuse and a shield with COVID, and you have a lot of people unemployed, so there's much more talent to choose from right now, it's a perfect storm for creating a time for wage decreases, because by nature, they know people are desperate for work. And so I do fear. I think we have to keep that in mind. And as we work and companies come for us strategically, we've got to try to use our discussions and influence to make sure we can make companies aware of those realities. I think oftentimes we have met with employers that are not even aware of the inequities within their own operations or the impacts of the potential, compensation packages that they may offer, and see that while this may seem appealing, you're not considering these 5 things that workers like yours have to consider. And so I think these are the discussions as workforce developers that we have got to make sure that we stay in the game and we stay involved in the discussion, so that as we begin to evolve into what is going to become this new economy for us, that we can try to keep those issues of importance.
Jamie, I wanted to jump in. I know that, you shared those numbers about permanent job losses, talked about kind of the big elephant in the room with automation and, what, all of that looks like. Short term, we're seeing a lot of the lower skilled job requirements, but, looking long term, we know, that people are going to need higher skills, and hopefully
Absolutely.
that leads to higher incomes. We're able to build strong communities and, really get the state to a level of prosperity that we, haven't even seen before. But kind of what are those actionable steps that we all need to be thinking about now to get, individuals that may have been displaced, had those permanent job losses? I know that we've started to see, that kind of the general public just isn't kind of understanding the huge impacts that automation may have on the economy, and how, so how do you think that, we can start connecting with individuals that are unemployed right now and really getting them to start thinking about what are those opportunities to upskill now and move into industries that are growing and will really provide good opportunities for them and their families?
Absolutely. I think that is a fantastic question. And it's one that's why I said when we saw that trend, at least short-term trend, where we're seeing an uptick in jobs that are actually decreasing their required job requirements, I think it can be a good chance for us to capitalize on, like what you said. I have no doubt long-term we're going to return to where we were before, to where we know requirements are going to continue to increase as demands on those jobs increase. But if this can be a chance, within our work, we call it our transitional jobs. If this opens the door for us to take individuals who are entry level now to get into some of these jobs that have lowered requirements, and then use that work experience as a base for then building upon and growing through incumbent worker training, I think there is a strategic opportunity there. I think when you talk about what we need to do, it's the same things we were preaching before in terms of setting up that long-term pipeline of exposure, experience, and then training. The challenge, again, is I think we've got to continue to focus on that right now, but until we have stronger data, it's hard to do that. I think we use this data that we've seen today. I don't think this is going to change too dramatically. The shades of gray and the nuances absolutely will. But what's hard right now, especially at the K through 12 level, and anyone on here that works in K through 12 can attest, it's hard to have these discussions right now because they're just trying to stay above water. They're trying to figure out, how do I teach my kids basic 7th grade math? I can't think about how I relate that to what they're going to do in 10 years. And so the progress we were making on that prior to COVID has at best stalled. I don't want to say we've gone backwards, but definitely has stalled, because it's just hard to keep that focus and keep us focused on that when they're doing all they can to figure out, how can I teach these 17 kids on Zoom right now? So I think until life returns to normal from an education standpoint, I just am realistic to know those conversations are going to just have to hit pause for a little bit. Maybe by fall of this year, and if schools are back to somewhat normal, we can pick that back up and try to make more progress. As we look at our 3rd round of funding for sector partnerships, that's things that we're having to take into consideration of what's a realistic timeline of trying to work with K through 12 providers, and even post-secondary, of now working with them in their new normal and seeing if they do anticipate a shift back to where we were before, or if this is the new norm, and what challenges and opportunities that presents. And so that may allow you now to begin to offer things in your K through 12 level that you didn't prior, because your students can get that post-secondary online now. So again, these are conversations that I think we're early on in, and that will probably ramp up in the summer and in the fall of this year as we begin to understand maybe what the world is.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Any other questions from the group too? Feel free. We've got just a couple minutes. But Jamie too, I wanted to just see, if y'all have started to see kind of a different level of demand and support services to kind of help get some of that. I know we've got so many folks that are trying to educate their kids while they're working, yep. People that have been, working multiple jobs and then also trying to change jobs. Have y'all started to see kind of those tangible things of what is, being asked to help get people into new training programs, credential programs, things like that?
Absolutely. And that's why I saw somebody's comment there, and they're spot on when I said this is why we need to get innovative with finding funding to invest in upskilling and then supporting that. 100%. The challenge, like I said, is not only is there demand on our system right now when resources are down, there's not just a demand, but there's an increase in the need for those supportive services. And so there is a desperate need for additional funding there, because we know, I mean, in traditional times, things like transportation and childcare are difficult. Well, now it's not just they can't afford the childcare. Finding a childcare facility is hard right now because either they've shut down or they're not taking new students because they can't accommodate because of the virus. So it is a challenge. I mean, I think it's a lie to say that, oh, it's just money alone would solve it. It's not. We've got to wait until things get to functional again before we can solve those issues. But we are working, we realize at the state level, we have a strategic partnership now that we're trying to make progress on, starting with an online referral tool for all of our non-core partners. So SNAP and TANF and DECAL's CAPS program. We realize there's a lot of disparate resources out there now that can serve a lot of the same individuals. And because the systems themselves, by federal funding and state funding, are all separate, it makes coordinating harder than one may think. I've been doing this 8 years, and it's not that we have never desired or tried to do this. It's just challenging. And so we are now making sure to see what can we do, how do we offer guidance to show what's the ideal way to take someone that may qualify for all or most of these services and to try to overlace or braid those funding sources to provide the maximum amount of support and benefits. And that's what we're trying to figure out. And it's beyond just saying, okay, here, send them here and they get all these resources. It takes some strategic planning and realizing that some populations require just a different level of case management than others. And so if our funding can't, provide or pay for that case management, how do we pay for what we can, but use these other sources that are currently paying for training too, and say, hey, you pay for the case management, we'll cover the cost of training, and let's partner together so that we can make sure our performance is good because you can help walk them through it on the case management side. Those are the discussions we're having at the state level. There's a million fires at the same time, so it's not like it's the only thing we're working on, but it is one that we're hopeful for. And as we've engaged our partners, we've had several meetings throughout this crisis. We're working on that portal now, and the next step is trying to work together on joint guidance post-pandemic when there's money there, because it's hard now. You don't want to point people toward a dead end. And so instead of creating new resources to connect people to our system just for them to say, sorry, we're out of money, we're trying to get ready so that in the hope that there's additional and supplemental money given that we're ready to serve.
No, absolutely. And Jamie, just really want to thank you for your time. For everyone, we'll email out the slide deck and make sure that y'all have Jamie's contact information too, in case y'all have any follow-up questions. But Amy, wanted to turn it over to you for any closing thoughts, but just really appreciate everyone's attendance today and great questions.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Jamie. This has been fabulous. We obviously need to have you on again because I think we could have gone a while longer. I just really appreciate that you're an integral part of our workforce system, and just thank you for all the information and knowledge you brought to us today. We really appreciate that. So final notes for everybody. Again, we launched Max membership in December. You've got through the end of this month for the 21% discount for 2021 to be an inaugural member. If you haven't done that, please go ahead and do that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Joy. And again, Anchor Investments questions, you can reach out to Rob LeBeau. Our next Max Minutes is January 22nd with Brenda Smeaton at Georgia Justice Project. And she will be talking about how individuals looking to get their records expunged, the process they need to take, and what supports are available to do that. So if you're working with any populations with background barriers, this would be a great program for y'all. So we've done this with some of our other work in the opportunity ATL space, and it has been really helpful for both employers and for job seekers. So given the amount of work that y'all do with individuals with background barriers, I think it will be very beneficial. And then we're always open for suggestions. Daniela I'm just grateful to what she's done with our Max Minutes programming, but it's a lot of programming. So if there are topics that you think that we need to be considering or speakers we need to consider, please let us know and we will start putting stuff in the mix. And then with that, again, thank you to our anchor investors. We appreciate your support and what you have done to get us to this point. And we need you to continue your support. So thank you. And finally, just everybody, thank you for joining us today. This has been a great session, a great end to a tough week. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and that the coming weeks are much, much better. Have a great one, everybody. Thank you.